I'm Break. We're here at Symmetry Studios, where I do all my music. We're above Club Motion in Bristol, and I'm going to run you through a drum and bass track, which is mainly what I produce amongst lots of other music. This is what I'm best known for, so we thought we'd check out a forthcoming track which will be out probably 2015, called Temptations, which will be on my next EP on Symmetry Recordings. And basically this is a slightly more minimal track, sort of textile, but kind of with some nice musical vibes as well. So I think it will cover a few bases of a few techniques and kind of how a simple tune can sound good without loads of tracks and plugins. I think this track started from a sample that I found, and it's a kind of strange 80s kind of rock experimental album, and I just found a little clip from one of the intros, and I looped a section of this. And usually what I do in a lot of my tracks is find a sort of a loop from something, or even just a sort of ambient sort of soundscape, and then use a Rhodes piano to sort of harmonise or just create a bass line or a new progression that kind of works with that original sound. So I'll just play you those two on their own, because that gives you a little idea of the kind of intro bed that goes under everything. So this is the Tempted sound, which is a kind of a cool synthy kind of filmic bed, and this is the Rhodes on top of it. So we just got a simple pattern. I've not even put chords in on this occasion. I've just put the root notes of the progression there to give you a nice looping harmony that goes round. And I've added some little clips from acapellas to this, just to sort of vibe it out on the intro, which fit with the chords. Processing on this sample was quite minimal. It sounded great to start with. It was off a sort of CD quality, you know, source, so there wasn't too much vinyl crackle or anything like that to get rid of. So I've literally, from looking at it, there's a bit of automation, which is just that's a delay on bus 1, which is an H delay on a quarter D setting, which I think at the end here will just do a little echo off, which sort of blends into the breakdown. And then I've got a FabFilter Pro Q with just a couple of low cuts. I'll see what it was like without the low cut. Probably I've cut the bass in order to make space for this Rhodes part, which I've also used that EQ to take out some kind of low resonant humming, so we can hear quickly what those two sound like without the EQs on, just to see what the reason for that was. So yeah, there's a low, it's got a slightly different turnaround at the end there, so that's part of the reason why I just chopped that bass out and then refilled that area with the Rhodes to put a new sort of bass progression underneath it. And I'd imagine it's just a little bit too thick, the Rhodes without the EQ. I just wanted to keep the intro kind of light and not thin, but kind of not too bassy, so that when you come into the drop and the breakdown you get a lot more impact from the low frequencies coming in there. So it's quite a simple intro, really, sort of five or six sounds doing that, which fills out quite a nice intro to mix in. The Rhodes sound, I've steered away from it a little bit more recently, but a lot of this tune here in general is kind of I made it fairly quickly to just sort of capture the vibe quickly, and I've used all my old kind of tried and tested kind of plugins and techniques, and this is just the standard EVP 88, which is the Logic Rhodes that comes with it, which is not bad. I've used it on hundreds of tunes, and it doesn't sound madly real, but it works, and I'm quite used to the sound, which it works quite well as just a single bass riff without being too weighty, and some Rhodes get quite boomy. And we just got a tiny bit of bass and treble, a tiny bit of drive to just tone it up a little bit. No stereo or chorus because it's a bass part, but actually with this setting it does slightly come out on the left. But I found that the original sample was slightly on the right. I've got +3, a tiny bit of panning on that, but I think if I was to look on a what do you call it, an imager, I think this sample is slightly more on the right. It's quite stereo in general, but in the room there's a bit more on the right going on. So yeah, that just fills out the stereo a little bit with those two sounds. And that's pretty much the intro, to be honest. So I've just got a simple kick part going for that intro, just to keep time when you're mixing, and just to keep a kind of slightly filmic thud kind of going through it, which is a Rob Papin punch, which on this track basically I did actually, which I rarely do, but I went mainly for single hits, partly as a little experiment just to see if I could make a tune with single hits, because I often don't and sometimes struggle to. But this plugin, which is mainly just a drum machine, I quite like, because you can add noise to the kick, which gives it that kind of slight realness. So yeah, with this kick drum, I think it was, I flicked through some presets, found a good starting point, and just tweaked the pitch. And where are we here? So yeah, the noise is great on this, because without it, it sounds like you're more housey, kind of clicky kick drum, and adding that noise just gives that little bit of air, almost like a hi-hat, but kind of just a bit kind of ticky but sort of airy. So yeah, I've picked quite a short one, kept the decays quite short, because as we'll see, when the bass is added to that, long decays on the kick drum often blur into your bass. And that's why this plugin's quite handy, because you can really shorten your decays and get a short but punchy kick, which does work with the name of the plugin. So we got that ticking over, and then this is a Logic kit that I've put quite a lot of plugs on. We've got a couple of Logic reverbs, which just give it a bit of space. When using single hits, I usually keep my reverbs more for the percussion, to keep the single hits sort of punchy and tight, but to put some air into the whole beat with the hi-hats and the bongos and shakers, so it's not all dead and it is in a sort of room environment as well. A tiny little EQ cut. I think most of these plugins, I think that chain may have almost been from the preset, which was a warped pop R&B kit. On this kit I've also got a bus going to a Lexicon Hall reverb, which is on a large hall with the light setting, which basically means it's got a high pass cutting out a little bit of the bass. It just makes it slightly brighter, and that is automated here at certain points to come up in the breakdown, actually, where we've got a kind of woodblock clave sound which comes in. I'll flick over to that so you can hear the... And what I did with this track was slightly took the housey approach of having the reverbs build up in the breakdowns, and then as it drops it'll close down to dry again, so you get that kind of contrast from big space to a small closed space. And that's a lovely reverb, the Lexicon, to just give you that big, spacious sound. So yeah, I'll kind of get over to the drop and this breakdown and just see what happens and run you through what I did pretty much. So have a look. This is the build-up sound here, which I think is dry. Yeah. In this breakdown, I'm bringing in the bass sound, which I got from Trillion, which is either bass guitar or synth bass. I kind of think you call it a module. Yeah, it is total bass module. And this is it's a kind of, I don't know what you'd really call it. I guess it's a lead bass sound. I've got a sub underneath it. So there is some automation on this one, and that was partly what I was just saying with the sort of housey element of building up the reverb before the drop, which is this automation here, which closes down to 0 on 65 where it drops. And I've also got just with the fab filter, a high pass coming down, which probably looks like this. We can see that going as it does with a resonant peak to give it some little bit of edge. And I've got a little dip here in that sound to make some space for the sub bass that's underneath it, which is around that same frequency. So I've just carved a little bit out of that bass sound so that when it is fully dropped, this sub part can sit underneath it without clashing too much. I really like Trillion. It's got a great sound because the samples in it, you can see in the picture in the description, they all come from old school analog synths. And Trillion I use a lot with the bass guitar element of it, which just sounds amazing. It's the best bass guitar sort of sample engine you can use, and it has lots of settings to tweak that sound. I think with this one, it's more like a sampler, that's why I really like it, and I prefer almost tweaking samples in a sampler format than with synths. And you've got a lot of those same settings, the cutoff, and the the envelopes that you would normally have on a synth, but you've got a really good quality sample sort of basis that it comes from, which is, I just think everything in it sounds really thick and warm, and that's why I quite often use this as opposed to a lot of soft synths. I haven't distorted this where often I would do. I think that sound is probably partly the natural sound of that synth, which is a little bit crunchy. And this preset from the synth, barking Swede, I'd imagine the bark is a little bit of the edge on there. You've also got an effects part of here, and I think it's the tube limiter and this flame, which is like a kind of preamp driver plugin, which is on a loud setting with gain here. Those sort of add element. What number is that on? 4.7. So yeah, a little bit of that crunch is coming from here. Flame is like a kind of a driver section, so it's quite good this, because it's almost like a guitar rig and a soft synth built into one. And then you've also got these quick settings here, so you can just easily get in on your filters and envelopes, and the distortion's off on here, so it's not really distorted too much. This one, it's quite a clean track, so I've kind of kept the basses fairly clean. So that's the bass, and then that combines up with a sub part when it drops, which actually is another Trillion. I think when I got Trillion, I just rinsed it out for a few tracks, and this is one of my favourite settings. It's just a sort of 106 Juno sub sound that's just really simple, but it, rather than using other subs that I'd often use, this one's got a really nice weighty sound to it. and it's got that good click, which is quite associated with drum and bass. With this one, I've got a couple of low cuts on it. It was really subby. I often use the Cambridge and the Fab filter. They're both really good for low cuts. Where are we at? 30 hertz on the Cambridge, and I'd assume it's pretty much similar on here. 23 hertz with an extra little dip at 17. Because through the subwoofer this one was really kind of rattly and did need quite a lot of low cutting to keep the level loud. And I've also got some limiting on the sub area using Ozone 5, so everything under 117 hertz, it's got a slight reduction on the limiter so that I can get 2 dBs more sub overall in the mix. And that's a little bit more on the kind of kicky, slight thuddy area, which kind of clashes with the kick drum a little bit, so that's pulling that down just to keep it smooth really, and quite a lot taking off this top area. So I'd assume if I bypass that, it's all that click, which I'm not too into because it starts to click in with the drums too much. So it's a lot of smoothing off with this, which does make quite a bit of difference when you take it off. It's a bit ticky and a bit pokey, so this smooths that off and does sound rounder. And then I've used a 3G. It's just a great free plugin from Synapsis, which is really good for using as a leveler. I'm not sure, I'd assume that's on there. Yeah, we've got some automation change on the sub, which I think is in the breakdown in the middle of the track, and it's really just a fade out, but I never really use the Logic faders for automation because it just gets confusing and you can't turn it up without going back into the automation, so I always use a gain plugin at the end of my strip to either fade or change the level of plugins as the track's going through. So I'll play a bit of the drop and just sort of see how, because there's a few little tricks going on to get this whole mix of the bass and drums sitting nicely. So a plugin that I'm using on the sub, it is effectively a sidechain. It's from Waves Factory, and I bought this a couple of years ago. Not many people know about it until now, and it's just, I couldn't really understand why no one else had come. Maybe they have, but I've never seen a plugin that really does this so simply. You set your bus sidechain input, which for me is bus 7, which is coming off the kick, and that's just going to an empty bus channel with the output turned off, which just gives you an empty feed of the kick to send to anything else. And so I've sent the kick to this track spacer, which is on this Trillion sub 106 clicky sub part. If I solo these together, you'll see the kick inputs into this, and it's basically just a frequency dependent sidechain, kind of like the Wave C6 does or other multi-band sidechaining plugins. But if you want to, you can tweak up your frequency. So if we pull this up, you'll see it leaves some sub uncompressed, but it starts to flap, so we don't really want that. So I've got it all the way down, so every time the hit hits with the sub, it's scooping out the kick's frequency out of the sub, so those two frequencies will just never clash. And this is just a really handy plugin for sidechaining without it sounding too sidechainy. It's more of a ducking style plugin than a full-on sidechain. And with this percentage, you can, I often am usually around 30%, but because there was just a lot of sub in both of these parts, it dips it out really well without affecting the either source sort of too much. And with inside this, you've got attack and release settings, and mid-side settings as well, which we don't really need because it's bass. And I'd really recommend this plugin for often musical parts where you want a vocal and a synth to not clash too much, or like in this case bass and sub. It's just really handy and not too fiddly, and you get that pumped but smooth sound with minimal clicks on the front and tails of the kick source. So that's, I think I'll show you what that's like without it on. You get that horrible fart on the front of the sub where the kick hits, and I'd have to EQ out more sub from the kick if I wanted to do that. So this is really clever way of just keeping the sub in your kick without that fart happening. And you can hear the setting I've got, it almost eradicates the sub slightly on that first hit, but within the mix of the track sounds quite good. The sub slightly creeps back in after this one. Also in this programming, I've only got one kick in this actual pattern, which often you've got your second sort of two-step kick halfway through, but with this I just mainly went for one kick at the front, and the snares and percussion are doing most of the work. So really the trick with this track was to try and keep it sounding groovy and kind of sort of live-ish without actually having any breakbeats really in it. So as it kind of progresses, a lot of the technique was building things up and dropping them back down. So every kind of 16 or 32 we've got shakers stopping or other shakers coming in, and I basically used a few shaker parts that I've already got, a couple of these sort of house loops which are almost like a breakbeat but have a more dancey feel, and just layered them in sort of subtly behind that kick and snare. Another little trick on this one, for example, that's the kind of house loop, which has got a few things going on in it. And I've actually sidechained this one with the Pro C from the bass. Often I do that from the kick and snare to make the loop kind of suck around the beat slightly, so that the hi-hats in between the kick and snare pop up. But with this one, and I think possibly a couple of the other ones, they've got different side chains depending on how they sounded in the mix. For these next shaker parts, I've used bus 8 as my sidechain send, which is actually being sent from the snare and the kick part. The snare we didn't really get into earlier, but that was a similar Rob Papin thing with a few plugins on it. I'll give you a quick play of the snare on solo. And it's a clean, really pitched up with a lot of white noise, a tiny ring taken out of it with the Pro Q, which just stops that slight whistle. I've used the SPL Transient Designer to shave off a bit of the tail on the sustain of it, just to make it shorter. It's quite hard to notice, but in the mix it slightly cleans it up a bit. And again, the Ozone 5, one of my favourites. This is actually just, it's only gating that low mid area. If you slide the mix off, you can hear that whoa, whoa, sort of on the tail of it. And so this is clever because you can keep the front weighty but remove the tail of it, which is a little bit boxy and kind of roomy sounding. And so that keeps it a bit drier and more kind of clinical. And And another favourite, the Elysium Music EQ, which on this one is just doing a little bit of 400 Hertz to put a bit of weight back in, where you slightly can lose the body of it from gating it. You can then boost back in a bit of weight afterwards on that area to keep it sort of chunky. So not that noticeable, but it's just 2 dBs or 1.5 dBs. But you can feel a little bit of body come back to that, a bit more pop in the low mids. Cheers for checking out this teaser. For the full rest of the video, get yourself the latest issue of Computer Music Magazine. We'll be going through the rest of the track and a few more cool tips and tricks. Cheers, catch up soon.
Download over 30 exclusive plugins. Get hundreds of pro-quality samples and power up your production skills with in-depth tutorials. We break it down for you step by step, and you'll see exactly how it's done in expert video guides and producer masterclass sessions with pro producers. Get all this and more with Computer Music Magazine every month on iPad and iPhone, PC and Mac, Android, and in print.